World War II in the Pacific, the period of Japanese ascendancy, or the period when the Japanese were most successful, from the 1930s through May of 1942. The background of Japan leading into World War II. So after being forced open by the US in 1853, Japan immediately went through some very rapid industrialization and political westernization, which we studied in earlier units. The same time, however, Shintoism, the cult of the emperor, Japanese exceptionalism, etc., remained very, very Japanese and proudly nationalistic. So it wasn't just a copying of the West. Japan remained Japanese, but picked up Western elements that would allow them to compete with the Western imperial powers that were dominant in the Pacific at that time. Part of the Japanese modernization was the 1889-1890 Meiji Constitution, which created a constitutional monarch with the emperor and democratic forms like a parliament, actually called the Diet in Japan at this time, creating what we would think of in the West as a modern political structure, very similar to what most countries now have. Although in that government, like in a lot of governments in Europe as well, the democracy and the government were pretty much dominated by the monarch, in this case the emperor, also the military, which was very powerful because Japan was militarizing really heavily in its attempt to stay independent and to compete with the West, and also zaibatsu, or big corporations, basically in the Western sense. And those big powers basically dominated the Japanese democracy, much like they would have in, say, Britain or Germany or something like that leading up to World War I. And in the midst of all this, you have the fact that the Western nations, the United States, European nations, were not really taking Japan very seriously. The United States was treating Japanese civilians within the United States, Japanese Americans and Japanese residents moving into America, quite poorly, which made the Japanese feel that no one took them seriously correctly, which was true. The Europeans in the United States did not, and made the Japanese quite angry. The Japanese at the same time had become powerful enough to force themselves on Korea and then later on to China, which will be the beginning of World War II. The background of China is even more complicated because the Chinese had gone through, the Opium Wars and the failure to industrialize in the 19th century, unlike the Japanese. And so they finally kind of stumbled into 1911, actually, with a old imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which collapsed. And when it did collapse, which was 60 years later than the Japanese began to westernize their military forces and economy, China could now begin to do that sort of thing. So the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 was late as far as Chinese being able to defend themselves, but it did kind of open the door to pretty radical change. The party that became the vehicle that would try and modernize China to keep up with the Japanese and the Western powers was called the Kuomintang, or the KMT, and that was headed by Sun Yat-sen, which took over the government in China in 1912. That was a very hopeful time in China. People believed that Sun Yat-sen would be able to kind of hold China together. He was this hugely influential, charismatic figure that everyone hoped could kind of salvage China. Unfortunately, that was not to be. But because Sun Yat-sen was so popular, he was able to kind of keep together a whole menagerie or group of very disparate, very different kinds of people within China. So Western-oriented modernizers, communists, Christians, nationalists, business interests, all kinds of other people who normally would fight together did join together in the KMT under Sun Yat-sen to try and help China. It was basically all hands on deck, even if everybody disagreed with each other at this point. Unfortunately, the Japanese, the Europeans, and the US continued to tear into China economically and in some cases militarily to keep China from being able to rule itself, which made Sun Yat-sen and the KMT's goal of modernizing China much, much more difficult. And the fact that the KMT itself, the Kuomintang itself, was so a hodgepodge of very different kinds of people made things very tenuous. Could a party this complicated actually hold the country together and also improve it? And that was a really rough thing. And all of this came to a crashing halt when Sun Yat-sen contracted cancer and then died almost immediately in 1916. So really only kind of 4 years of hopeful time. And then he died of cancer, which led to the various wings of the KMT turning on each other in a civil war, particularly the communists and the nationalists. The communists were led by all kinds of people. Eventually it would be Mao Zedong, but at this point not yet. And Chiang Kai-shek was the guy leading the nationalists who would actually win the Chinese Civil War. And so when the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek did win the Civil War, the communists found themselves basically massacred, particularly in Shanghai and various other places, and forced out into the countryside to become guerrillas, which for communists didn't make a lot of sense at that point, because the communists are supposed to be part of the working class, and here they are hanging out with the peasants, but they were beat. And honestly, without the Japan War, without World War II, the communists would never have come to power in China. So in many ways, Hitler is the reason why communist China exists in this very weird way, or the Japanese are, but Hitler even more so than the Japanese in some ways. So once he had control of China, Chiang kind of continued to try what the KMT had been doing under Sun Yat-sen, which was to rapidly expand the economy and the military of China to be able to keep up with the Japanese threat, with the European threat, with the US threat, and also improve the Chinese economy at the same time, which was a huge thing to do. And they were well behind everybody else. So Chiang definitely had his government had his work cut out for him in creating a functional government. And Chiang himself was pretty honest as far as anyone can tell, and his wife was a huge political figure, a woman who spoke English fluently and was able to work well with foreign powers and things like that. Chiang was, however, trying to control this very giant country and needed a lot of help and a lot of military support from other powerful Chinese people. And so as a result, there was a lot of corruption within the KMT government. Chiang put up with that corruption because he didn't see any other options. And Chiang also flirted with fascism and various other kind of militarist things. So Chiang was not overly popular with his own people, although he was the most popular person in China at the time. And unfortunately for Chiang Kai-shek and for China, Japan was way more powerful, and Japan pushed themselves into China, particularly in northern China, northeastern China, in the very resource-rich region of Manchuria. So the Great Depression, like in Europe, also impacted Japan, and that caused significant problems for the Japanese and also opened up significant opportunities for the Japanese. First off, the US and the European countries closed off their economies to the Japanese. They wouldn't allow Japanese to export goods to Europe and to the United States, basically because the Europeans and the Americans were hoping to close off their economies so that they could, buy everything locally and therefore give their own people jobs. It wasn't that they were being particularly mean to the Japanese. They just wanted, American jobs for Americans. The Brazilians, the Chileans, all sorts of people did the exact same thing. It was pretty much every nation for itself at this point. That did harm Japanese industry. And the key problem for the Japanese was that they did not have significant natural resources in the islands of Japan. They are fairly resource poor, and so they had been manufacturing goods and selling them, and then with those proceeds, they were buying all the resources they needed, like coal and oil and iron and all the things that keep an industrialized economy going. So when the Great Depression hit, the Japanese found themselves unable to export and thus unable to import, and they faced economic disaster as a result. This unfortunately pushed Japan towards war and put a lot of power into the hands of the military, which would eventually lead the Japanese into the incredibly self-destructive war that they would wage. And at the same time as that is happening, the opportunity side of this was that the Japanese saw that the United States and the Europeans were radically reducing their military commitments in the Pacific, in Asia, because they, of course, had their own bills to pay in the Great Depression, and so they couldn't really afford to have arms and ammunition hanging out in the Pacific because they couldn't afford it. And also Hitler and the fascists were rising in Europe, so particularly the French and the British were moving a lot of resources back towards Europe, and thus the Japanese saw Asia kind of open for the taking, as long as they were willing to risk a war with the Europeans. And they weren't yet willing to risk that war, but Hitler hadn't started World War II in Europe yet. But the Japanese began to think, like, we could take the stuff we need. And the region that was closest to them to take all that stuff from was Manchuria. And Manchuria was Chinese, so taking Manchuria would not spark a war with the Europeans or the Americans. And the Japanese bet correctly that they could take Manchuria away from China, get all those resources, and that no one would do anything. And that is, in fact, what happened. China was attacked. They lost a huge chunk of resource-rich land in Manchuria, and no one stopped them, the Japanese. And here you see basically the Japanese attack on Manchuria. So here's China proper, here's Japan here. The Japanese had already taken Korea in 1910. And so it was a fairly straightforward thing with this very primitive Chinese army at this point, which they were trying to modernize, but just had not gotten anywhere close to where the Japanese were. So the Japanese just came in and seized all of, as I said, northeastern China or Manchuria. And so this part shows the success of the Japanese in 1931, which is arguably kind of when World War I sort of began. There really wasn't much break between this and World War II, between this and World War I. And at first, everything went really well for the Japanese. Their gamble paid off. They had already taken Korea in 1910, so it was pretty close to get into Manchuria, no big difficulty. And the KMT military that they were facing was completely unprepared to stop them. The Chinese nationalist military was too small and too unsophisticated to do it. And the Japanese were able to set up a puppet government in northern China in a region or a nation they called Manchukuo, although no other nations recognized that fake Japanese puppet country. Raw materials began to pour into Japan, which revitalized the Japanese economy, allowed them to kind of, basically expand their economy during the Great Depression, and particularly because they were building so many arms and planes and ships and stuff like that, that actually kind of kick-started their economy. It turns out that militarism is a way to successfully move out of depression, and so the Japanese were doing that. So everything kind of looked good for the Japanese militarist government in the mid-1930s, kind of like it looked good for Hitler's Germany at the same exact time. And the Soviets under Stalin, of course, bordered what was now Manchukuo and Korea. And so, the Soviet army was kind of locked down facing the Japanese. And luckily for the Japanese, the Hitler and Mussolini's acts of aggression also kind of were causing all kinds of problems for the world. And the League of Nations, which was the UN at that time, and the various Western powers did nothing to stop the Japanese. So the Japanese gambled like Hitler had gambled, and it paid off for both of them. Here you see a general map of the Japanese attacks up through 1938. So here's Manchukuo, the thing that the Japanese created out of Manchuria. Here's Korea that they controlled. And this is showing the kind of lines of attack that the Japanese would do in what I'm about to do for the rest of the lecture. You can also see the Japanese were easily able to take coastal cities because they had this incredible navy and air force and all kinds of other stuff. So this sort of shows what's going to happen over the rest of the course of this lecture. Also, this points out that a lot of Europe, or a lot of Asia, was controlled by European powers. So Indochina, which is today Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, was controlled by the French. Thailand was independent, although closely intertwined with European and American powers as an exporter, but it was independent. Burma was controlled by the British. India was, of course, controlled by the British. The Philippines at this point were an American colony, U.S. colony, and so you had a lot of European and Western powers, including the United States, surrounding the Japanese. And so even though the Japanese were successful in China, they faced this problem of Europeans and the United States kind of limiting what they could gain. And so when the Japanese seized Manchuria, combat kind of never did stop after that, but it was very light between the Chinese and the Japanese. Like Chiang Kai-shek knew he couldn't take back Manchuria, and so he just sort of bided his time while he tried to build up his military to try and retake that, but that would be a decades-long project probably. And however, the war does break out, and neither side wants it. In 1937, the Sino-Japanese War begins. This is really when World War II starts, in my mind and in most historians' minds. Sino, by the way, just means Chinese. And so 1937 is really kind of a better way to think of the beginning of World War II, because the Sino-Japanese War will just continue on and be joined by the Europeans eventually, and thus it's World War II. Neither side, like I said, Japan or China, wanted this war. The Japanese had already conquered everything in China they wanted to conquer, and they were fully aware that conquering this massive nation of China would be impossible and expensive and self-defeating. However, they couldn't effectively leave China alone if China kept messing with them. The Chinese had given up so much that they couldn't give up more. And so strangely, like a little conflict at this tiny little bridge in northeastern China called the Marco Polo Bridge, where some Chinese soldiers and some Japanese soldiers shot at each other, and no one actually knows who started it. Both sides just kind of kept escalating it a tiny bit, pouring more and more troops in, until eventually it broke out into a full and massive war that would eventually kill millions and millions of people. So some accidental gunfire at a bridge started a war no one wanted, and a war that would not end for another 8 years. The war in China went very well for the Japanese at the beginning. They were much more sophisticated militarily. The Chinese army was tiny. Actually, it was a huge army, but the part that could actually fight the Japanese with any meaningful ability was tiny. And so the Japanese just kind of carved into China. Their navy and their air force, which was completely overwhelmingly powerful compared to the Chinese, allowed the Japanese to capture city after city on the coast, which was where most of the industry was, where huge chunks of the Chinese population were, because most humans tend to live on the coast. And so basically, even though China territorially remained fairly independent of Japan, like there were big parts of China that weren't controlled by Japan, most of the population of China was under Japanese control. And so basically things looked very, very bad for the Chinese pretty much throughout the war. But you know, it started badly and it stayed bad. The Soviets tried a little bit to help the Chinese, but other than that, really nobody helped Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese government, and the Japanese were able to just sort of do as they pleased. The only kind of silver lining to this whole nightmare was that because the Japanese tied themselves up in China, that did mean that they couldn't attack the Asiatic part of the Soviet Union, and that took some heat off of Stalin, which would allow him to be able to be successful a little bit against Hitler later on. So that was the only benefit. And here you can see the early successes of the Japanese, you know, basically getting here's Manchuria, here's Korea, coming across at the Marco Polo Bridge and things like that into northern China, which is a huge chunk of the people. And then also a war broke out around Shanghai, which again was sort of an accidental thing. This is where the Chinese army really got chewed up and where you really saw the success of Japanese naval and air forces. And then you can see the beginnings of the attacks on the other major population centers of coastal China. And the Chinese had bumbled into this war and proved completely incapable of actually waging it, unfortunately for them. They began to fall back more and more rapidly in the north. And at one point, in one of the most bizarre events of basically all of human history, Chiang Kai-shek ordered that the dikes or the dam kind of things that hold a river in place be breached with explosives. When that didn't work, they actually used shovels. And they ordered the Huanghe to be breached, fully knowing that that would flood this massive part of the Chinese countryside. And the hope was that by flooding a huge chunk of northern China, including drowning all the people in that region, it would slow down the Japanese. This is arguably the largest act of environmental warfare in human history. Somewhere around 28,000 square miles were flooded. That's 54,000 square kilometers. And somewhere between 500,000 and 900,000 Chinese were killed, either in the flooding or even more commonly in the famine and disease that followed. But basically, the Chinese sacrificed somewhere around 500,000 to 1 million of their own people in order to stop the Japanese. And that didn't even stop the Japanese, that just slowed them down. It shows you the scale and the desperation of this fight. And unfortunately, after the Japanese did get across all of that, the Chinese forces were already in retreat and basically were moving into the interior of China so quickly that they began to abandon city after city without any preparation at all. So the civilian population had no time to escape. The Japanese weren't, usually there's some negotiation when a country conquers another city to deal with the women and children and old people and the, civilians, so you don't have to murder everybody in the city. That we don't normally do those sorts of things anymore. Nanjing was an exception to that. The Japanese, when they took it suddenly, and there was very little control on either side. Japanese soldiers and the Japanese military proceeded to go on a totally nightmarish spree of rape and mass execution and looting that basically destroyed the city and is one of the greatest acts of war criminality in human history. Somewhere at least 300,000 civilians were killed. Basically everyone female would have been raped. It was an incredibly brutal act. And the world did absolutely nothing about it. And here you can see where that happened, Nanjing or Nanking. So the Chinese had already been coming in from the north. The Shanghai invasion allowed them to come in through there, and they basically just chased the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek out into the interior, particularly to Chongqing or Chongqing, very far up the Yangtze River, where they could barely be supplied by anybody, and basically they kind of just lived in isolation while the Japanese controlled the vast majority of China. And so by late 1939, the Japanese had conquered all of this. They had taken a bunch of Pacific islands, and they had also taken most of China. And now the Japanese found themselves staring at this region right here, which was full of other resources, and because World War II had begun in September of 1939, was now very quickly free for the taking, because France would be defeated, Indonesia would become undefended as the Netherlands was defeated by the Germans, the United States would be distracted, the British in India would be distracted, so the Japanese had taken a lot and began to think, maybe we should take everything. The Chinese were in retreat and really couldn't do anything, so they had kind of been removed from the table, aside from tying down a lot of Japanese troops to make sure they stayed up in the hills. But really, the Chinese weren't doing very much. There was a small communist guerrilla movement fighting the Japanese. Mao Zedong was one of the early leaders and a very successful early leader, and he would eventually rise to power in the Communist Party as a result of his opposition to the Japanese. The Japanese did try and set up a puppet government in China under Wang Jingwei, who was a Chinese nationalist who basically saw an opportunity to rise to power by working with the Japanese. He also hated Chiang Kai-shek, although that puppet government attempt largely failed and was extremely unpopular, but the Japanese did make their attempt. And here's a Japanese propaganda poster for Chinese consumption, which is kind of interesting. Here you see Chiang Kai-shek, and he's up in Chongqing, up in the hills, like hiding or holding his head in his hands as he's being bombed by Japanese planes. And the Japanese did bomb him reliably up there. And then you can see all the parts of Japan or China that are conquered by Japanese forces. You can see Japanese or Chinese industrialists running into the interior, and very importantly, they have a dollar sign on this little bag showing that these are like Western imperialist forces or money that's fleeing and taking, theoretically the money of the Chinese. You see the Japanese puppet government under Wang Jingwei, the nationalists centered here around Beijing, which theoretically are offering the Chinese someone to rally around. And the Japanese are kind of claiming only to control Korea for the Chinese audience. You can see here Manchuria, although that was definitely in the hands of the Japanese, was shown as an independent state, not red. So there's a lot of kind of lies in here, but you can see the Japanese Navy, Japanese power, blown up cities, the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek cowering in the hills. And this was kind of the Japanese hope that they could convince the Chinese to work with them. And that hope did not pay off. And then the Americans get involved. The United States begins to kind of push Japan in very small ways after this, and things in Europe begin to push things forward to where the Japanese will eventually strike the United States at Pearl Harbor. And so Hitler was definitely obviously moving towards World War II, which we've already covered earlier in this unit. And so Western powers were completely distracted, not paying any attention to the Japanese. The US, however, did decide that because of what the Japanese were doing in China, and also because the Japanese were a big threat to the United States by this point, and American allies, the British and the French, the United States decided to stop selling oil to the Japanese. And since we were the Japanese oil supply, the Japanese had to rely on what supplies they had stockpiled in big tank farms and stuff like that. And so the Japanese were on borrowed time, and they kind of realized, like, unless they could find their own oil supplies, they were going to have to give up everything they had taken. So we didn't start the Japanese on the road to war, but we definitely put the Japanese into a situation where they would have to decide, did they want a war with the United States, or were they going to give everything up? And for the Japanese, they didn't see a good option there, and they made the wrong choice, which was to attack the United States. And it was the wrong choice because they were going to lose, in addition to every other reason why it was a wrong choice. So the key target for the Japanese was Indonesia, because there are big oil fields in Indonesia, and the hope was, for the Japanese point of view, that they could conquer everything in Asia, knock the Americans on their butt for a little bit, and then we would, because Hitler was going to win in the Japanese mind, be forced to cut a deal allowing the Japanese to keep the stuff that they had taken. The Japanese never thought they could defeat America, the United States. They did, however, think that they could take all this stuff and make it so expensive for us to take it back that we would let them keep it. So the Japanese weren't trying to beat the United States. They were just trying to steal everything that they could steal, take everything they could take, and then get us to negotiate a truce. That was the Japanese plan, and it was a pretty bad one. And here's the plan of the Japanese that completely worked. They'd already attacked in China here, and their plan was to just attack into all of these regions, basically simultaneously, using their aircraft and their incredibly dominant navy. All of this stuff was going to be conquered in their mind in December of 1941. By that point, the French had already been defeated, so the French army in Indochina was basically surrendered already. The British were desperately fighting the Battle of Britain, so the idea of the British being able to oppose the Japanese was laughable. The Dutch in the Netherlands had been defeated by the Nazis, so this whole region, which is where all the oil is that the Japanese were looking for, so the Japanese just saw all this stuff basically with the door wide open and realized like they could take it. And if they could figure out a way to keep the Americans from stopping them from taking it, the hope was they could, like I said, take all this stuff, fortify it, Hitler would win in Europe, and the Japanese would get to keep this all. So that was their plan. And in order to carry that out, they planned the Blitzkrieg that I just showed you, and they planned to attack Pearl Harbor and hopefully neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough for the Japanese to take everything. And so all that stuff on the map I just showed you happened, and the Japanese success was absolutely total, except for the first day of the war when they lost it. They did sneak attack us at Pearl Harbor, and the idea, like I said, there was to destroy our fleet, which would thus make it impossible for us to help anyone in the Pacific. Unfortunately for the Japanese, and fortunately for us and everybody else, they did miss our aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor for weird, lucky reasons. None of the carriers were in Pearl when the attack happened, and they also, very importantly, failed to destroy the giant amount of oil that was in like storage tanks in Hawaii, particularly around Pearl Harbor. And the failure to destroy those carriers and that oil supply meant that the entire Japanese plan was broken from literally the first day of the war. In fact, in many ways, the Japanese lost the war on the first day. And the guy who planned the whole thing, Yamamoto, believed that they had lost the war on the first day, like failing to hit the carriers, failing to hit the oil supply, guaranteed that we would be able to strike back almost immediately, which we did. Had Pearl Harbor gone slightly differently, the Japanese might have actually gotten what they wanted, but that wasn't going to happen. And after Pearl Harbor, after the first day of the war, it really didn't happen. It's kind of the equivalent of what happened with Hitler failing in the Battle of Britain. Both of them were air attacks, and both of those air attacks were extremely successful, but not successful enough. The Japanese, when they conquered all the places I showed you on the last map, basically announced themselves as the liberators of Asia, and they tried to sell themselves to the people of the Philippines, of Indonesia, Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia as liberators. They were coming to free Asia from these white people, which was a thing that could be done, and it was definitely kicking white people out of Asian nations that they had no business controlling, the United States out of the Philippines, the French out of Vietnam, and things like that. But the Japanese claims of liberation ran pretty hollow. They claimed that they were creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere so that all of these Asian nations would do well, and Japan would be kind of like their big uncle who'd help them out. That didn't really work out in practice. In practice, the Japanese were just a different kind of imperialist. They were Asian imperialists as opposed to white imperialists, but they still were looking for the oil, looking for the timber, looking for the coal, and they didn't much care what the locals thought about that. It's interesting, if the Japanese had won, would they have become nicer? Probably not. But, it's one of those what ifs in human history. But definitely, when you kick out the one guy stealing your oil and replace him with a different guy stealing your oil, the locals, the Filipinos, the Indonesians, the Vietnamese were not like, yay, in general. Although there were some,
people like Wang Jingwei in China, who did see the Japanese as a possible ally against European imperialism, and a whole lot of people in Asia who felt like the Japanese, although they were bad people, had kicked out the Europeans, and they began to plan, these nationalist Indonesians and Filipinos and various other people, to make sure that when the war was over and the Allies did win, if they won, that these nations would not go back to being colonies. And by and large, they did not. The Japanese, although it wasn't their intent, did end up freeing Asia from European and US imperialism. And this is how far they got. The Japanese did take everything within this red line, including a whole bunch of this. And as soon as they had taken it, however, basically within 6 months, it began to unravel, and the US began the extremely long and brutal war of going island by island and taking all this back, which would eventually end in the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would finally force the Japanese out of the war in 1945. After, in total, in World War II, at least 50 million people had been killed. And so this war was a disaster.